All right, it is time for another video presentation. Good to see you again. From your standpoint, it's probably just one chapter has gone by. Unless you're watching this year, this school year, because it's been a while since I made one. It is now 2023. And our video for today is about sustaining biodiversity on the earth, on the land. So we're going to be talking about these categories: the forests, the public lands, the grasslands, the wetlands, and also talking about cities. All right, so the question is, how should we manage forests and public lands? So the forest, why should we, is another good question. Forests are huge in biodiversity. That's one thing, and they also supply ecosystem services. And this is stuff that is obvious, I guess, in some ways with the logging. So the wood materials, of course, are things that we would be using. But also the forests are a big place to, besides the habitats that I already mentioned for biodiversity, but they do sequester the carbon as well. And the intact forests are also good at preventing erosion, which saves us money because erosion is a costly thing for us. And right now we are doing a combination of preserving them and developing them. And we'll talk more about that stuff. But the forests, besides what I've already mentioned, that's a big source of water being stored and released for transpiration through the plants there. And because of this, it affects local climates in a big way, helps maintain climates. And also there is, like I said, the wood that we mentioned, but also medicines. We find a lot of things in the forests that have turned up in modern medicines, but many of them are based on things that are in the forest. So besides this, they purify the water and the air, so that's a good thing for us. And like I said, store the carbon. So another thing they have is, besides the fuel wood that firewood that we've used there, and lumber, there is mining that's done there as well. And recreation, people enjoy going there, so that's an ecosystem service for us. And all of that supplies jobs for people. All right, so let's talk about, okay, here we go. Here's some of these slides I should have been probably advancing, but that's what I was just talking to you about. Did I miss any? Oh yeah, and then when we clear them out, we can use them for livestock grazing. Okay. All right, and let's see. So there are lots of different kind of forests that you could talk about. Old growth forests are considered forests that have been relatively untouched for 200 years or more. And in that time, there's been lots of natural selection to get them to that old ecosystem. And so there's a lot of biodiversity there. And a second growth forest is one where you cut it down and then it came back through secondary ecological succession, which we know about. And that means you might have cleared it out. A large part of the area here that we see as trees here in New Jersey, where I'm making this video, is a second growth forest. A lot of this was cleared out. New Jersey is called the Garden State. It was used as agriculture. And as we moved a little bit farther west, we found other places that were also good for agriculture, and some of this grew back. The soil was still there, but that's why it is a secondary growth forest. Another thing that we see more of now are these tree plantations. So this is where you grow a species, usually around the same age, and a lot less biodiversity. You're growing for a particular species or a couple of species compared to the forest, which would have had lots of different ones in them. So we have different kind of forests around. Here's a nice old growth forest. I do like walking around in the woods. And the woods out west are different than the woods around here, and everywhere you go it's a little bit different. And just an amazing amount of diversity and, in my opinion, beauty. But these are subjective things, right? What people find as beautiful or not. All right, the forests, like I said, with the ecosystem services, they put a price tag on these things. So they've talked about the waste treatment that we're talking about. Purifying the air and purifying the water is valued at $22.5 trillion. I guess these are... this book is from 2019 or something like that. So anyway, these numbers just give you an idea of what we're talking about. But this is an interesting thing, a newish thing, a relatively new thing, where we try to value the environment and think about the amount of system money that is supplied to us, or what we would have to do if the natural places weren't doing it for us, what we would have to spend to make that happen. And typically this doesn't come across in the price of the products when you utilize these resources. And maybe that would, if people valued these things a little bit more. Because once they're gone, these services will still have to be done if we're going to survive and have quality of life, but we won't have the natural way of doing it. So I mentioned erosion control. They rate that at 16.2 trillion per year. Food production, okay, that's a good one. I don't know if I was mentioning that exactly. And nutrient cycling, of course, all the stuff that's going on in there. You have to have that to live too. So very good. Okay, so we have been developing this stuff so quickly, these forests and all that stuff, that they estimate that we've been losing 20.2 trillion per year since 1997 of the ecosystem services that nature can provide for us. So this is stuff that we could be, if using sustainably, it could be of value to us for years and years to come. But right now we're not doing that. And as I mentioned too, we're not paying for it. We're really borrowing from the future in a sense, because these system services won't be there for them, and we're making our short-term profits on them when we develop for them. So that's the idea there. We don't put that price in the goods, the price that has to be paid further down the road, and is already beginning to be paid. All right, so this is an idea of tree plantations here. So you see that's a palm oil plantation that they're growing, and just the idea of a tree plantation. So you clear them out, keep planting them, and certainly sustainable. That's a positive. Maybe by developing these tree plantations, we can cut down on the old growth forests or even secondary growth forests. We can let that biodiversity develop as it normally would without clearing it out. In the tree plantations, of course, the biodiversity will be less, but since we're already starting to do that, that might be a good step. The problems when we are going in there into these natural settings begin right from the beginning. As soon as you start the idea that you're going to do this, you got to build some roads. And in building the roads, you're fragmenting the habitat already. You're separating it. Some species have to roam across these areas, and now you've fragmented them. Think of a turtle trying to cross the road as opposed to a turtle walking through its natural environment there. You've probably seen turtles crossing the road. Maybe you've helped a couple. But now there's a road there. And that's where it starts. You're fragmenting the habitat immediately. You're compacting the soil, which makes it not aerate and do what it needs to do as much. And you're bringing in this heavy machinery. So we cut the trees in a bunch of different ways. Selective cutting is you go in and you pick out the trees that you want, but you want to leave some trees as well. So you take the trees that you're going to do in smaller groups, and you're going in, and that's costly, more costly. It takes more effort. You go in and you do that. It might be more sustainable, but that's the trade-off on it, the selective cutting. And for the clear cutting, you just take out everything there. It's the most efficient way of doing it. And it's also the most devastating. It just takes out everything and anything. We have another thing with the strip cutting, and that's the idea of clear cutting, but you just do it in strips. So you'll strip across one area, and you'll leave some other area. So that's the idea of that. Here's a little graphic that shows you the idea of how quickly development is going to change the ecosystem. And you've probably seen this kind of stuff in your lifetime as well. On my ride to work currently, I'm watching the development go up, and I watched all the trees come down over the course of the last year or so. It doesn't take too long to do that. So here you got an idea of it. Right away you build the highway, and then you develop around it. And like I said, we've probably all seen this. I'm currently seeing it on my ride to work right now. All right, here's an idea of the selective cutting, so that gives you a little bit of an idea. Think about this stuff on the slope, and there's a reason these pictures are showing you the slope there, and that's because of the erosion. So the trees and any kind of plants really are going to hold the soil more naturally intact, and that's going to cut down on the erosion. But, with the selective cutting, you can maybe keep your stream clear. Not going to happen with the clear cutting. And then you see the strip cutting as well. So that's a graphic that helps you out there. All right, with these forests, we can talk about fires now. Fires are important to talk about. Fire's not all detrimental, really. There's some value to these fires here. And in nature, there would be fires pretty normally and pretty regularly. It's something that would happen. And it's a way of controlling the leaf litter, too. Once you build up the leaf litter, you have all the materials for fire, for a big fire, if you let them collect. But if they burn out intermittently, then you have the chance of having smaller fires to deal with. So these are called surface fires, and they're really on the surface, so they're not as big maybe, and they have value. There are some species that only develop after a fire. Like I said, they also take some of that litter out, and rather than having it accumulate and wait for a huge fire, that's some of the benefits of it. So it can be good, these surface fires, and they're kind of they're normal. They're to be expected. Nowadays, they do what they call prescribed burns, and the prescribed burns are where they will go in and create a small surface fire and control it, and then stop it when they want to stop it. Well, at least that's the idea, and it seems to be pretty effective. Crown fires are more destructive. Crown fires get up in the top of the trees, that's the canopy of the trees, and they burn the whole tree down, and they spread from the top of one tree to the top of the next and burn down all the trees around them. Much harder to put out, much larger, and again, maybe some of the crown fires could be avoided if you intermittently burned up the leaf litter at the bottom. But we've been involved in fire prevention over the years too, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But there you go. And more and more we're hearing about these fires, and it's become a thing that we're hearing a lot more about. And part of that is for climate change. Climate change is lengthening the fire seasons in areas where there typically were fires anyway, but they're making it a longer season. So here's a picture of a surface fire and a crown fire. Yeah, when I was young, they had the big Smokey the Bear campaign. And in the Smokey the Bear campaign, the idea was only you can prevent forest fires, and every forest fire must be stopped. Now, there's reasons to stop the forest fires anyway, right? Because, if they burn out of control, you can get to where human structures are, and then you're losing a lot of money, and people would lose their homes, and animals have their habitats as well. But like I said, there's an advantage to these smaller fires. So actually, in having that plan of controlling the fires, we actually created more leaf litter and more fuel for fires later on. So with good intentions, some of our management techniques have caused bigger problems and unintended consequences that we didn't see coming. All right, so about half of the world's forests have already been cut down, so that's a big number, right? So deforestation is a thing now. And with the deforestation, this is the removal of a huge area of forest, and we do it for agriculture, we do it for settling, for building, and for our own purposes, anything that we want to do there. And tropical forests, which are located in areas where people don't have a lot of money, are especially rich in biodiversity, and they are especially subject to this kind of stuff. And we're not just doing it here or in tropical forests, it's also happening out in the boreal forests, more of the coniferous trees. Like in Russia and Alaska and Canada and places like that. Deforestation is happening everywhere. So, as we've talked about before, this increases the water pollution and it degrades the soil, leads to more flooding. There's less to control it there, extinction of species, release of CO2, and the loss of the absorption of it. And this is the look of it. It's also the look of dollar signs, so you have to remember the economic and the environmental aspects of it. But it takes a lot longer to come back, and you could argue that the economic gains are temporary compared to the ecosystem services that are being provided that have such a high value to them. So between 1620 and 1920, when we were settling into the United States, we cut down a lot of the forests in the east, as I mentioned before. And these forests that we cut down here are coming back through the secondary succession, like I said. But that's where the first settlers from Europe came over here and did that. Okay, so yeah, we've cut down on a bunch of the biodiversity in that, and that's what we've been doing in the way that we've been managing our lands here in the United States. And this has been an ongoing process as well. But this gives you an idea from 1620 to the year 2000. So we had you can see it, right? We took them all down, and then through secondary succession, we got a lot of forests coming back. So that's a good thing, I would think, in my opinion anyway. So that's the history of it there in the United States. All right, so the tropical rainforests, like I said, these are in more developing parts of the world, people who don't have a lot of money anyway. And we've already talked how poverty is a contributing factor to environmental problems. So these are in Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, and a lot of this has been happening since 1950. We've become more industrialized with it. And of course, the population of the planet is growing, so we go after these resources. And again, as I mentioned, palm oil, which shows up in lots and lots of products, is one of the reasons for this stuff. And what happens is they clear out an area, they grow these palm trees, and they get the palm oil from it. But in these tropical rainforests, this might be a little bit counterintuitive because you think of them as lush growth and all that. And they are, right? But they are really, the soils don't have a lot of nutrients in them. They're cycled so quickly. And if you think about it, like here in the New Jersey area with their temperate deciduous forest, we have leaf litter every year that comes down. They don't have that. So what happens is they make these plantations after clearing out the forest. They use them for a little while, and then they have to abandon them, and they move on to the next area. So it's a cycle. And that's the poverty of the subsistence farmers. And they use them for ranching, and they use them for lumber, and as I mentioned, the palm oil. Palm oil shows up in lots and lots of different products, from lots of different foods. You go in and go through the grocery store and look at the foods, and you just look at some labels for a while. You're going to see palm oil in there a lot. All right, so what can we do about this stuff? Now, one of the things that we can do is start telling people and informing people about the value of this stuff and how it could be more sustainable for them, and actually could be more economically viable for most people if we left them intact. So educating the people is going to be an important part of it, and that's going to be interesting to do. The thing about it, like I said, is it can be economically beneficial for a lot of people, and right now it's extremely economically beneficial for a small number of people, the people who own those companies. But the people who have to live there, and if they're planning on having their families live there for generations to come, for them it's a different story. So these are things that we can do. So we can talk about the systems. We can, another thing that we can do is maybe say we're not going to subsidize this stuff anymore. Governments subsidize this kind of development. Our government does that. Maybe we can say we're not going to do this to old growth forests anymore. And maybe we're going to say that we're going to do replanting every time we take down some trees. Or we're going to rely more on tree plantations, but as I mentioned before, and let the forest go. So that's something we can think about. All right, so and again, we might want to think about doing things a little bit more sustainably. So there we might talk about things like the maximum sustainable yield. How much, instead of just going in and taking everything, maybe we could think about it ahead of time. How much can we take out and it will still be sustainable? And that would be a different approach than we've used mostly, but it's a developing thought process for sure. Okay, and then, we might also look at ecosystems that are particularly viable and decide not to take them out, All right, so all of this stuff involves living and learning, like a lot of things in life do. So, part of it is trying some things, seeing what seems to work or what your intended outcomes are, and then trying to go toward them and revamp your thinking as you go along. So that's pretty good. All right, so yes, the maximum sustainable yield, as I said, talk about the ecosystems that you're talking about, and be ready to make some changes in your management style as you go along, and be more sustainable in the forest. All right, so those are some good ideas for moving forward with the forests. All right. Okay, I've already mentioned the Smokey the Bear campaign, so management of forest fires and prescribed burns I already mentioned. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there, but this is the topic heading that I was talking about there. Doing the prescribed burns, as I mentioned, and letting some forests go rather than putting out every forest fire. Hey, another thing here I see that I could mention is that drones are a good way to do this, right? They used to have people who would spend their summers in the forest and they would be up the fire towers and they would have surveillance. And now we could have drones doing that kind of thing. So that's we could get the technology working to our benefit in that. Although I've heard some great stories about people who spent their summers in the middle of the forests and had encounters with bears and all kinds of things, and it does sound like a fun job. A lot of great stories in that area. Okay, so that's something we can do. Another thing that we can do is we could start cutting down on the demand for these trees in the first place. We have other paper sources that we could use, plants that grow quicker, aren't wood-based plant products. Canaf is one of them. Was originally an invasive species, but it could be used to our benefit. Hemp is another one. Rice straw is another one. And also another thing that we can do, and this is across the boards as we start getting into these later chapters, is we can take all the processes that we're doing and be adaptive in our management of them, meaning that there's lots of inefficiencies that have gone into these things. And that probably dates back to times when we thought all these things would last forever, but they don't. Another thing that we do in a big way, and you've probably seen this in your life too, is we just have these throwaway paper products. The mail, when you get the mail, it comes to you and there's all this junk mail and it goes to your mailbox and it's delivered with fossil fuel vehicles and it gets to you, and then you take that's been developed and you throw it right out. Or maybe you put it into recycling and the process goes around again. Think of all the lineup of single-use paper products that you see every time people get coffee or soda or something like that. And that's the deal there. Here's the Canaf plant. Like I said, it grows quickly. It was an invasive species, is an invasive species, so that's a problem that you got to manage it because it grows so well. But then they found out paper could be made out of it. So if you can control that, that's a pretty good one. All right, so maybe cutting down on the tropical stuff. There's things that you can do. There's the illegal logging that's going on there, so maybe you can crack down on that a little bit. Another thing that you can do is you can make sure that when you do purchase a wood product, you purchase one that's only sustainable. Maybe at some point that would be a regulation. Only sustainable use wood products are okay, Maybe replanting would be a good thing where you've already had the devastation with the idea that you're going to continue it into the future. And another thing is sometimes they do these debt for nature swaps where these people have debt in the country and they say, all right, we're going to forgive your debt, but we're going to pay off your debt, but you can't develop these lands anymore, a debt for nature swap. So that's something that people can be doing. Okay, so here's the other things. Yeah, all right, so protect the endangered areas, educate people, subsidize sustainable use, rehabilitate areas by replanting. Okay, reduce the poverty and slow population growth. That would be a good one. And encourage the secondary growth succession. All right, very good there. All right, so now we're going to go on to grasslands. Grasslands were very important, and we have degraded them. I've talked about that in class probably already, but this whole area that we now call the United States was open rangeland. And there are species that were needing these huge areas to move across, and it was sustainable for a very long time, including humans, but not the amount of humans that we have right now and not the approach that we've taken. So now, when you ride around the center of this area here, you'll find out that everything is fenced off, and so there is no migration, no mass migration that could happen the way it did before. But this is the way people lived in concert and in a synergistic relationship with nature for so very long. They would follow these bison, and even the bison and the plants worked together. So the bison would not rip the plants out from the ground the way we till with our agriculture, they would pull them out. And there were things they found out in the saliva of the bison that helped the growth of the grasslands that they were relying on. And then the people who were living at that here at that time were definitely and by design sustainably harvesting the bison. But that all changed when the settlers from Europe came in. My predecessors came in and just slaughtered them all off. And part of that was to control the people who were living there already. So that's a big deal there, and a big change of life since human beings have come on the scene. Okay, so there are things that we can do. We can, with these grasslands. Now we use them for our livestock also, and with the livestock we're letting them graze there, so just like the bison did, but now we're controlling them in our fenced off area. But if you controlled the numbers rather than overgraze the land, that's what we've done in the past. So overgrazing is the thing, and then trying to restore the grasslands. They have the short grass and the long grass prairies that covered so much of this area that we call the United States. And now, in traveling around the country, they have little national parks with little pockets of what's left over. But it used to cover so much area. And by the way, it's a good point to mention that that's true everywhere in the world. That's not just a United States thing. All right, so these rangelands can be overgrazed, like I said, and these are areas that are not fenced in, and these are areas that just let animals go in through there and just go wherever they want. But with our growth of cattle, we have overgrazed these lands with the detrimental results that I already talked about. And now all the the plants are gone. That leads to your erosion, and also there's no viable food for the animals that you wanted. All the habitats are lost, all that stuff. Pastures are these areas of grassland that have been fenced in, and there you can control it a little bit more. But that's the idea of that. All right, so you cut down on the grass, you compact the soil, it can't hold the water as much, there's more erosion, and then there are also species that come in that can invade because the cattle don't eat them, and then you've got invasive species, and you've dramatically changed the entire ecosystem. So that's the idea of the rangelands and the pastures that I've mentioned there. And here's an idea that there's one that's been overgrazed on the left-hand side, and that's what you get. So after a while, when you clear out the forest and you clear out the land, you end up having a desert. There's no nutrient cycling. That's bad news for you. The side on the right is a little bit better, but that's also got its problems as well. So there are things that we can do. One of the things is we can do rotational grazing. So put your cattle, control where they're going to be, and put them in an area, and before you overgraze it, move them to another area and let that area recover. Keep moving them around. So that's another thing that you can do. All right, so let's see. So this is something that is, like I said, if you overgraze it, it's bad. But even as the bison were moving in there, the stirring up of the soil in a small way is a good thing. Aerates the soil, helps the soil out, gives it a little bit more fertility, stirs things up a little bit in a good way. So some of that was good. Actually, like I said, it was all set up to work. I guess it had evolved over a long period of time, probably before even humans were there, that these animals were going over these huge amount of rangelands that no longer exist the way they did. All right, so here's the managing of it again. The rotational grazing that I mentioned, fencing off the damaged areas, and just trying to be a little bit more, keeping your animals and your plants all together in that. There's a lot of talk about that right now, and we might have talked about it in class already. I know I've mentioned that kind of thing. But people talking about a new approach to agriculture, a no-till style of agriculture, where you have multi-crops growing at the same time, and that you're constantly regenerating the soil by not pulling these things out the way that we've done before and tilling the soil over again. Also, the animals being in there in a small way, in a controlled way, can help out as well. That's some fertilizer. Like I mentioned, with the bison, there was things in their saliva that was helping the grass to grow. So it's really, I guess a lot of this stuff comes back to we took over from nature and decided we had a better way of doing it. And some of the stuff that we're looking at that's more sustainable is going back to the way nature was doing it originally. A lot of the stuff is like that. So here's the idea of an area that was overgrazed and grew back again. A lot of the cattle and a lot of animals as well, that are not raised by human beings, they like these river zones. And the name for these river zones is riparian, and they're rich in biodiversity. You have to have that water as well. So you get the plants that grow a lot around them that give the habitat and the cover for some prey species as well as predator species, and you got a rich environment there. But I like to use that term with you, the riparian zone, and make sure you're aware of that one. That's a nice term to describe the area along rivers. So there we go. Okay, so now we'll start talking about the wetlands. Wetlands are areas that are near water and land. So they're a combination of both. They're covered for a good part of the year in water. And, you could talk about swamps, or you could talk about estuaries or areas that are near the water. And those are all wetlands. Now, people like to be near the water. When it comes down to the ocean, people really like to be near the water. And of course, there are wetlands there that supply all kinds of ecosystem services for us. But we sure do like to live there too. So we have developed them. And since 1900, the United States has developed over half of its coastal and inland wetlands. So we're doing that in a big way. And we're not even the leader in the world on that. Other countries have done a lot more than we have. So that's the idea of the wetlands. These wetlands, as we mentioned before, supply all kinds of ecosystem services for us. They slow down the storms. They soak up the water flow when a storm does come in. I've heard it said that for every mile of wetlands, you slow the winds by 10 miles per hour. We've had some huge wind events here. Well, by now you all might be a little too young to remember, or depending on when you watch this video, that we had that Superstorm Sandy. That's the latest big one that we had come through here, and the winds were devastating. That was the worst part of it, was the winds. And the wetlands slow down the winds by 10 miles per hour for every mile of it. But we make them for cities, we build roads on them, we take out the minerals, we take out the oil, we take out the natural gas, we cut down on this stuff, we try to get rid of them so the insects will be gone, not realizing that the pests, the insect pests also have a role as well. And that's been a problem. Here's the Florida Everglades. This is an area here in the Florida Everglades. It was just naturally covered. They called it the Sea of Grass. It was just this slow-moving amount of water and wetlands covering all this area here. But now, this is areas where people love to go. I gotta admit, I like to go there too. I used to live down in South Florida, and my family is from down there. So I understand the appeal of being down there, especially in the wintertime. It's beautiful. It's a paradise. So we want to live there, but it does come at a cost. So right now, they are trying to there are efforts underway to try to undo the damage with water diversion projects that have been done to the Everglades that have destroyed these ecosystems and set them up for invasive species. That's another big thing going on down there in the Everglades. And it's just an incredible undertaking. As we know, it's a lot easier to prevent a problem than it is to clean it up afterwards. All right, so that's the idea of the wetlands. Some of the things that we've been doing with wetlands is trying to preserve them, like I've been saying. They say about 6% of the U.S.'s, in the U.S., 6% of the inland wetlands are protected. What's left of them are protected. So it's 94% that aren't yet done. So now we come up with this idea of if you destroy a wetland, you have to replace it later on. So that's another thing that happens, and that's problematic. Some people say that they should replace it before they get to destroy it because it's really hard to replicate a wetland and replicate what nature has said they're going to do. But that's one of the things that they do. And, you know, if you do create new wetlands, you get permission to develop. It does work in that way. And some bankers will buy up those rights and then they'll sell them to developers. So that becomes a big deal. All right. So, yeah, so like I've already mentioned the Everglades here, and we've seen the picture. Okay. So, yeah, it's going to be a tough one to restore there, the Everglades. So about 90% of the birds that were in there are gone, and lots of other things are gone as well in there. And the invasive species have come in. People have released pythons in there. They buy them as pets, and then they find out they grow to be huge. Released them out in the Everglades. They have no predators out there, and they're just, sometimes they can eat a deer, and they get so big they can eat a deer. They have all these hunting programs for the pythons down there, the Burmese pythons, and it's incredible, some of that footage. You know, if you want to look that up on the internet, you'll see some things. All right, but the Kissimmee River was the one that they are trying to restore the flow of. They're going to try to cut out the canals and the levees and all these things that they put in. So it's an amazing engineering undertaking that they were able to do, and now they want to have to undo it. So this is at a huge cost here. And they're going to try to pump water back into the Everglades, but those are the things that are going on right now with the Everglades. Okay. And let's see, so how can we sustain these things? Well, we can come up with wilderness parks. That's a good idea. And we do that in the United States, and they do it in other parts of the world, where they say this is an area that we're just not going to touch. And maybe what we could do is identify places that are what they call hot spots of biodiversity. And if you know what the hot spots of biodiversity are, then you can maybe protect them, make sure that they don't get developed on them. Try to restore the other ones that you've already done. And then another thing is starting to talk about how we can live with the other species around us. I mean, that's traditionally what we've done, especially with the predator species, right? We come in and we wiped them out. Or with the bison, those weren't predator species, we wiped them out. But if we're going to move on and keep the biodiversity of the planet going, now that we know the benefits of it, then that's another thing that we'll have to look at. How can we live in somewhat harmony with these things? So restoring the ecosystems is, like I said, it's a lot easier to protect them and prevent it, but once they've been destroyed, you can try to go back and do them. So maybe and we're already doing this. We're coming up with an idea of where all these places are already, and we're going to identify them. And, you know, used to be that you didn't know what was going on 100 miles away from you early in human existence and for most of human existence, right? But now we do. So we can map it out, take a little inventory of what we have, focus on the things that we want to protect in the short term, what we have the time, energy, and money to be able to do with that. Maybe we want to, provide incentives for people who live in areas where there's nature to not have it developed. Those are things that we can do. Okay. We can maybe take a species approach, where we find a species that's endangered. We won't let development go on where those species are. That's an approach that we've been taking. Setting aside areas that won't get developed. Parks and preserves are things. We have a natural forest system in the United States and a national park system. The national parks are set aside for humans to enjoy and go in, and it really becomes maybe more of a problem because it's so popular. But the natural forests aren't as publicized or as widely visited. So that's something that we can do. All right. So let's see. Okay, I think I've covered some of that stuff with you. All right, so here are the hot spots, some of the hot spots that people are talking about. They have identified 34 of these around the world here right now. It's 2% of the Earth's surface, but that's where 50% of the flowering plant species are. So that's why they think these would be good things to do. About 1.2 billion people live in these areas, and about 5% of this stuff is protected right now. So that's something that we can be looking into. In 1964, we came up with the Wilderness Act here in the United States, and that was that we were going to set aside areas of public land and as wilderness. So only 5% of that in the United States of the land is set aside from the Wilderness Act currently, and about 50% of it is up in Alaska. So that's what we got going on right now. And it's harder and harder to justify this because, again, this is an economic and an ecological and environmental issue. There's a lot of money to be made in these areas, so there's constant stresses and consistent stresses with people who would like to develop it instead of not developing it. All right, so at park systems, there are about 7,000, between 6,500 and 7,000 national parks in 120 countries around the world. And yeah, so the popularity of these is something to be looking out for, because a lot of people come in there are degrading these areas. And in lesser developed parts of the world, they're less protected, these parks are. And there's people who are illegally poaching and mining and logging in there. And that's where the greatest biodiversity is too. So that's a challenge there. So the stresses on the U.S. parks, like I said, are the popularity. That's the big thing about them. You got to put in all these roads and places for people to be. I've been in Yosemite, beautiful Yosemite, and just enjoyed it so much. And I sat in a bumper-to-bumper traffic jam driving around to look at these natural sights. So in some places they do allow things, like off-road vehicles and things that are also detrimental to the parks here. So there are stresses. Popularity is the big one. Got to build cell phone towers because people need their cell phones while they're there. And so those are the big deals over there. All right, so for these reserves here, a lot of times what they do is they put a hot spot in the middle that nobody can get to, and then there's zones that go farther and farther around out of it. And the zones that are farthest away from that central spot, they'll allow some kind of activity in, and then they'll lessen and lessen the amount of activity as you get into the middle. Another thing that human beings are being aware of now is the ranges, like I said, of a lot of animals. Picture these African animals just roaming around out there. You can picture it in your mind. The zebras wandering through and the giraffes. Well, how do they get through once you've developed? I talked about the turtle in the road, but the same thing works when you fragment and fence up the area for species that are supposed to go long distances. So they built what they call habitat corridors, and that's a good idea for the habitat to move through. So the habitat corridors mean there's an area, and after a while, the animals are clever. They'll figure it out. They can get to one area from one area to another. Not the way they did in the good old days, let's say, but they can figure it out. I tell you, they're smart. I used to live in a place, in South Brunswick, for those of us who are in Monroe, not too far away, and they had a hunting season that took place in the woods around me. But you couldn't hunt right near people's houses. And don't you know, once the hunting season started, all of a sudden I saw a deer right around my house. I think they knew I wasn't going to shoot them on my property. But that's a whole other issue. There's so many deer now anyway. So, yeah, so the habitat corridors are a pretty good thing. And I already mentioned the buffer zone idea. So you have a hot spot in the middle, and then you might move out a little bit farther. And in some areas, you might be involved with development and even mining and all that kind of stuff. But that's the idea. All right, so here's an idea, speaking of bringing back the predators, where they brought the wolves back into Yellowstone. We've most likely covered in this class. I know in this school year we have, but the benefits that have come by reintroducing the predator into the deal there. So we eradicated them like we did the wolves most everywhere in the United States, and the coyotes and all this kind of stuff. But we brought back a bunch in 1996, and they changed the environment over there. You can imagine the plants grew a little bit better, and that meant that there was less soil erosion, and there was a lot of things that were going on there. But reintroduced what was naturally going on there. Okay, Costa Rica. So Costa Rica is a success story, I guess you'd have to say. Not started out that way, but they were doing all kinds of deforestation there with their rainforests, and they decided somewhere along the line, and not too long ago, that they were going to turn this into an area of preservation to try to be sustainable with ecotourism. So now lots of people visit there. This year, in 2022, 2023, actually just as 23 began, one of my students came back, and you may recognize yourself as I'm talking about it right now, and shared her experiences over there in Costa Rica, which was just fantastic. This is why I have the best job in the world, I get to hear great things from great people who are going to do great things in this world, and it's only beginning. But Costa Rica, a place that I would like to visit. But yes, they have turned it into an environmental success story. They are making more money than they did before, and it's sustainable is what's going on. So they are putting a value on the ecosystem services. They are trying to use less fossil fuels, and they are having all these areas where they're just not going to develop at all, and they're going to bring people through. Well, they got a nice setup over there. They got beach land, and they got mountains, and they got a rainforest, and they are having a success with this. So, well, this is maybe a guide for where we can go. And actually, let's go. Let's go now. I want to go now. Look at that. It's the middle of winter here in New Jersey. I want to go down there. Anyway, it seems like a great place to go. Amazing biodiversity that will now be preserved, right? Okay, so another thing we might do, another approach we might take is that we might talk about these ecosystem services. So we might go into areas that we know are providing lots of ecosystem services and protect those areas, right? These what they're calling life raft ecosystems, where these areas are just in a lot of trouble, and maybe in areas of poverty. So maybe we'll go and protect those areas and get people working together. And that seems to be the best approach, when you get the local people working with people who are maybe looking at a global view, and get the governments involved in how it'll be a positive thing. So another thing that we can do is restore these ecosystems, replant the forests, bring back the keystone species like they did with the wolves there, take the dams out. Dams have been great for hydroelectric power, so we're not going to be able to get rid of them yet, but we have really changed the course of these rivers for benefit to the human race. But it really breaks up the ecosystems and all the ecosystem services that could be supplied by them. So there we go. So all of these systems, coral reefs and forests and anything that we've degraded, wetlands, we could do that. Okay, so what we want to do is identify what we're doing and protect them from further degradation. That's what it comes down to. All right, so let's see. Oops, all right. All right, so another thing that we're going to want to do is restore the things that we've destroyed before. We've already talked about these things before, so there's not too much more to talk about there, but I do have some things that I want to say to you. And, we did talk about that. All right. So another thing is what's called reconciliation ecology. And this is where we take the other species into account. So we're going to try to live our lives with those species in mind, and know that they can live around us as well. So that's the idea of the reconciliation economy. So a big thing that we can do here is right in our own front and backyards. I mean, we've done this where we've got the aesthetic of a perfectly cleared out lawn is what we like to see, right? And there's no biodiversity there, I mean, we might as well pave it over almost. It's almost as bad as paving it over. But what if the aesthetic became that everybody in their yard would plant species that would be habitats, or species that would be good for pollinators, or species that would be lending more biodiversity? If everybody did that in their yard, that would be a big thing. Put up nesting boxes for birds, cut down on the pesticide use. These are things that we can be doing. We have dominated the planet. Maybe we want to find out how we can support the other species as well. So that's the reconciliation ecology that I've mentioned. And yes, and more about like what you're going to do in your community. Like, yes, it's nice to say, hey, we're going to put in some money to prevent rainforests across the world, but there's things that I just mentioned that we can do locally as well. All right, so plant a tree, recycle your paper, try to use less waste, these kind of things. All right, cities. Cities are lots of pollution, lots of waste, lots of people, lots of resource use, and lots of poverty. These are all big problems, as we know. But we can design our cities so that they're going to be more sustainable. There's a movement going on with that right now, too. But there are big things that are going on in these urban settings. And that is that there is a huge proportion of the global population moving into urban areas, and it's already there. And these cities are getting bigger and bigger. So there's more of them, and they're places with just lots and lots of people, mega cities and hyper cities, millions and millions of people, and the poverty is what's going on there. This increase in these suburban areas are more likely going on in places that are developing, and there are huge amounts of poverty. So these are potential problems for the human race, something to be thinking about. Look how big this is. There was just so many less people not too long ago. This is looking at the night sky and the area that's lit up. There are people in these huge cities. You look at the United States, I mean, really, just going from New York to Boston, it's almost like one steady city the whole way, from New York down to Virginia. If you ever drive up and down Highway 95, it's just, it's incredible how fast we've mushroomed, like bacteria in a petri dish. It's happened so fast. All right, in the United States, the movement to the cities started around the 1800s, and it's gone on into the 2000s. And right now, at the beginning, we were a much more rural nation, right? We were agrarian. And the city populations in the United States in that time frame, from the 1800s to 2020, where we are at right now, has gone from about 5% to 82% living in these urban areas. We live in an urban area. You know, you might not consider us a city, but because of where we are, we would consider ourselves that. So we did it. We did it in three phases, right? First of all, we went from the rural areas to the larger cities. And after that, we got the idea of the suburbs. So we branched out some more. And that's where we live now, here in Monroe Township, New Jersey, and lots of people do too. So that was the next big movement. And then as we collected in these areas, we're moving farther south and farther west. So we're populating all those areas as well. So those have been the movements in the United States, and we've created this urban sprawl. And we are really just a car-based society now, right? So all of this stuff is facilitated, made possible by the use of the automobile, but boy, it's not sustainable, none of it. So this is areas here where there are more than 1 million people, all these urban areas here with more than 1 million people in the United States. Not totally negative. There are some good things about this. There's economic development in cities, education, there's innovation, there's technology, there's jobs to be had. If you're recycling, you don't have to collect it from as far away. And if you're moving the city people into the city, maybe if more people are living in the city, areas on the outskirts could be protected for more biodiversity, less development. That's a possibility. And you can also, it's more feasible to do mass transportation there. So there's some advantages and disadvantages as well. All right, so this is what we have to input into the city, and this is what we get out of it. So people got to have their food, their water, you got to bring it in, you got to ship it in, you got all this stuff. And on the other side, you get all the pollutions, but the ideas and the wealth and the noise. And so that's the stresses that these cities put on the human beings that live around them. So there are advantages and disadvantages of these things. All right, they have huge ecological footprints. They have a lack of vegetation. The water is problematic. You got to get the people the water, and just having the water in this city area where there's so much pollution is a problem. So all of these things become heightened. Another thing is they're altering the climate. They have what's called urban heat islands. They can't manage the climate as well as areas that are covered with vegetation. So because of that, they are areas of heat. Like if you're looking at a hot day and you're looking at the temperatures, you know, you could say on the outskirts of the city, it might be 10 degrees cooler than in the middle of the city. So those are what's called urban heat islands. And that's part of the deal there. Okay, so when you're growing these cities, you can grow them up or you can grow them out. And in the United States, we've been growing them out more than up. In places like Hong Kong and Tokyo, Hong Kong and China and Tokyo and Japan, they have really advanced mass transit systems. They build their cities up high, so they're not sprawling out as much. But in the US and in Canada and places like that, we're more dispersed with our cities. And because of that, in the automobile, That's what we got going on there. Urban sprawl. So here's a picture from 1973 to 2013 in Las Vegas, Nevada. And this is the way we do it. Like I said, bacteria in a petri dish is what I reckon it to. That so much more development. All right, so when we develop and we have our urban sprawl, we are going to lose the cropland, lose the forests. We're going to use more pesticides. We're going to have more pollution, more runoff, and all this stuff that we've talked about. And then we don't like the cities anymore. We abandon the inner cities, and there we go. So there are places in the world that are designing these cities with more of a sustainable approach and more of, hey, let's impact the environment as minimalistically as possible. And one thing you can do is bicycles. Over there in the Netherlands, that's a big one. Other parts of the world too. But in the Netherlands, they have a lot of bicycling that's going on. It's pretty flat over there, makes it conducive to it. But yeah, they're quiet. Well, you know, you got to use them in the rain too, so that's a problem if that's your only method of transportation. But over there, you know, near the train station or near places of employment, bicycle racks just filled with bicycles. They don't burn the fossil fuels. People stay in good health too, right? If you're bicycling all the time. But yeah, it's not good for long trips. And you got to be out there in the rain too. Buses are another thing. Of course, you have to you know, really be careful because the people who are using the buses aren't going to be able to pay a lot of money for the buses. So the fares have to be affordable for people to use them. And that's something that could lead to a company not being able to make profits. So that makes it a little bit difficult. They're still involved with pollution, and you still can be caught in traffic and all that kind of stuff. But they're a viable option and widely used, and we'll see how that goes. Rapid rail is something they have a lot more of in other parts of the world. Over here in the United States, our trains between places are not quite as advanced. And so the rapid rail that we have here has a lot less of that going on. But yeah, it can cut down on a lot of the traffic and transportation costs. People would rather just jump in their cars is the thing. And mass transit is another thing. But it has the same, you know, mass transit, like short rail systems or something like that. They have the same drawbacks that the buses would have as well. So, you know, you have to be on their schedule and the fares as well. So they might not be cost effective. All right, so you can plan your land use. You can zone your areas. So when you design your cities or any areas, you can zone them with these things in with intents. But the thing is, developers also, and people who are looking to make the money on that, they have a different idea of what they should zone things to. So the way you zone things and the land planning becomes a big business for every town, city, country, and really globally it becomes. What do we want to do? What are our values? What are we going to do? So if we're going to do what they would call smart growth, we are going to try to do things that are going to be more sustainable. So if you are not going to allow development, maybe you get a tax break. Or maybe we'll tax on the land, not on the buildings that you put there. Or tax land on its value instead of the highest, giving the developers the advantage. Preserving your open space and not developing there. All right, so that's the idea there of the smart growth, and that's the concept with the ecosystem, so eco-city. So you're going to design it more thinking in terms of the transportation, the effect it'll have, the people there. You'll build areas in there that is also has some wildlife in it as well, so you'll reduce the urban heat effect. You know, maybe you're going to make sure that you grow the stuff locally. I think vertical farming is already starting on. I think vertical farming will be a big deal, where they take a big tall building and the indoors is where they do the agriculture. And if you do that in a city, then you don't have the shipping costs of bringing the stuff in from outside. You don't have to worry as much about watering because there won't be evaporation. You're controlling what you need. You don't have to worry as much about pesticides if you're controlling that environment. So this is a thing that we can do and are doing. All right. So this is the the transportation priorities, rather, of an ecosystem. Traditionally, it's been flipped upside down, right? Here in the United States, we put the value in the exact opposite order. But that would be a good way of creating an ecosystem, eco-city there. So in Curitiba in Brazil, they have done this with some success. So as Costa Rica is a good example of cutting down on deforestation. Then Curitiba, if I'm saying that correctly, is a pretty good ecosystem service. About 3/4 of their commuters use the mass transit systems and don't use cars. Cars are banned in the middle of the city, can't have them at all. Between the bus routes, you're going to have your high-rise buildings, so that encourages the use of it. They do a large amount of recycling, and they also give free medical care to the poor and child care and job training as well. And that seems to be a good thing to give people hope and have them think that they have a good place to live, and maybe they're going to protect it as well. So this is the end of our video. We certainly covered a lot of ground on this one, and I'll look forward to discussing these and more issues with you back in class. Good to know you, good people. Thanks for listening.